Over 1,200,000 individuals have departed California since Gavin Newsom took office as governor, and these departures weren't temporary tourists seeking budget accommodations, college students relocating post-graduation, or wandering drifters looking for a fresh perspective from a different interstate. Rather, they were intact families, employed workers, mothers, fathers, property owners, and renters, people with student backpacks in their vehicle's back seat, partially loaded kitchens, and sealed cardboard containers, folks who truly wished not to abandon their homes but finally grasped that remaining had transformed into an act of self-penalization. These individuals dismantled households they had dedicated many years toward purchasing, withdrew their children from educational institutions they had desperately wanted to trust, auctioned off furnishings that couldn't be squeezed into transport trucks, and steered their vehicles over state borders because the individual overseeing the state had rendered existence in the wealthiest, most boisterous, and self-laudatory region of America utterly unmanageable for the residents who genuinely attempted to reside there. He patronized the upscale French Laundry restaurant, simultaneously instructing the rest of the citizenry to isolate, comply, surrender, delay, shutter businesses, void events, mask themselves, tolerate hardship, and feign that the regulations were sacrosanct, even while the authors of those mandates handled them like mere theatrical background props. Subsequently, following the transport trucks, the proliferation of encampments, the sealed commercial entrances, and the families who ceased providing explanations and merely departed, he gazed into a camera lens and dismissed the significant California departure as a complete fabrication. Senator JD Vance was seated directly opposite him, possessing the concrete data points displayed on the table, not hearsay, emotional impressions, or idealized campaign language, nor the polished promotional depiction of California that progressive strategists market to contributors in luxurious hotel ballrooms, but rather blunt and weighty figures, the kind that remain indifferent to how effectively a governor smiles. Positioned across from him was Gavin Newsom, refined to an artificial sheen that felt nearly manufactured, the prototype of a politician who doesn't merely enter an area but instead makes an appearance enveloped in an aura of his personal public relations, wearing a meticulously tailored jacket with hair maintained with a level of precision typically reserved for ceremonial armed forces displays, and possessing a posture relaxed enough to imply control and practiced enough to expose it. He sat with the demeanor of someone convinced every chair within the chamber had been specifically designated for his use long before the proceeding commenced, like an individual who never experienced uncertainty regarding his place at the high table because every environment he ever encountered had already been instructed to regard him as absolutely preordained. His left hand rested upon the surface with the subtle assurance typical of a person accustomed to being photographed while skillfully pretending not to notice the camera's presence, and his right hand remained absolutely motionless, the profound stillness of someone assuming the entire room would revolve around him. Everything about his appearance seemed completed, refined, maintained, curated, and optimized for public presentation, precisely the way a showroom floor automobile is presented as finished, the way a model residential property is completed, the way expensive commodities are finished when they are intended to be admired from afar rather than tested under rigorous stress. Gavin Newsom began, stating, "Mr. Vice President, I genuinely appreciate this opportunity," and even before the final words of that sentence had fully settled in the air, the rehearsed theatricality was already fully operational.
The vocal delivery was fluid, the rhythm predictable, the facial expression managed, and the smile appeared precisely at the pre-calculated moment, functioning not as a genuine reflection of warmth, but rather as a component of the political mechanism. Newsom began by saying, "I wish to initiate this discussion with some background because background detail is crucial in governance, a strategy frequently employed by similar leaders who instinctively navigate first toward background nuance because that complexity is where legislative collapse retreats when it requires additional space to conceal itself. A single statistic can entrap a politician, but background nuance allows him to metaphorically reposition the barriers. California stands as the world's fifth most significant economy," he persisted, and the statement emerged with the well-rehearsed gravitas of a phrase he had repeated so frequently that it no longer necessitated active cognitive thought. He explicitly clarified that it wasn't fifth in the nation, but fifth in the world. He allowed that global distinction to linger in the chamber, visibly proud of the ranking and almost relishing it, as if the gross domestic product alone possessed the ability to enter a supermarket and reduce the cost of basic groceries, or as if a placement on an international metric chart could secure a lease for a teacher in San Diego or purchase a beginning residence for a firefighter in Riverside. We generate more gross domestic product than the United Kingdom, and we are the national leader in technology, in agriculture, in renewable energy, and in media and entertainment. It was the classic California anthem, performed from the identical sourcebook with the same gilded cover by the precise demographic that conflates total economic magnitude with actual societal achievement, because that cumulative wealth insulates them from the real-world repercussions of the regulations they champion. Approximately 1 in 8 U.S. residents resides in California, Newsom stated, shifting slightly in his chair toward Vance. The movement embodying the deliberate assurance of a competitor convinced the individual opposite him has already been defeated and simply hasn't yet learned of the outcome, adding, because California senator is precisely where the future originates. DC. The smile expanded by the exact dimension charm increases when charm is deployed effectively as a metaphorical weapon. He wasn't merely responding to an inquiry, but rather defining the parameters of the conflict, elevating California onto a pedestal and challenging Vance to appear insignificant in comparison, as it wasn't sufficient for him simply to justify his performance. He felt compelled to render any critique itself appear unrefined, regressive, unsophisticated, and nearly humiliating. Subsequently, he transitioned his focus to Ohio because when refined politicians exhaust their reserves of humility, they inevitably resort to geographic comparisons, stating, "I possess respect for the vice president, I genuinely do," utilizing the classic tactic of prefixing an insult with respect, as if that maneuver renders the disrespect more sophisticated. However, he explicitly represents a state that is ranked 47th in gross domestic product expansion. Newsom's repetition of 47th was far from accidental, serving instead as a deliberate rhetorical needle to ensure the statistic wounded without necessitating any vocal escalation. Behind him, a staff member shifted subtly, prepared to relish the moment because in scenarios like this, cutting remarks universally feel more sanitized when delivered with impeccable posture. Continuing his remarks, Newsom stated, "And I make this point not to be malicious," utilizing the precise phrasing individuals employ when they intend to be explicitly unkind while simultaneously seeking credit for politeness, but to offer necessary background detail because when an individual from Ohio delivers a lecture to California regarding governance, it's somewhat similar to. He intentionally paused, not searching for the appropriate phrasing, but rather compelling the audience to eagerly anticipate the punchline, before the smile finalized itself completely and he delivered the comparison. Well, it's akin to the operator of a local juice stand instructing Coca-Cola on corporate management. Legislative aides seated behind Newsom repositioned a document folder on the table with the self-assured movement of someone convinced the entire chamber had been decisively won. She genuinely believed that specific interaction would become the dominant viral clip. The California governor effectively downgrading the former vice president to the status of a local shopkeeper, the Golden State looming majestically over the Rust Belt, the embodiment of sleek modernity reducing the individual from Middletown to a miner selling disposable cups on a sidewalk. She had just witnessed her superior inform a legislative hearing that Ohio amounted to nothing more than a local beverage stand, and within the narrow, superficial dynamic of political arenas, that dynamic felt like absolute triumph. However, the senator possessed the definitive California metrics directly in front of him. $24 billion authorized, 1,200,000 residents departed, a homelessness catastrophe that intensified under the burden of historic expenditures, and a singular internal memorandum that insiders never intended to be seen outside the agency that generated it. Senator Vance did not resort to visible indignation because demonstrating outrage would have merely transformed the insult into a political asset for Newsom. Consequently, he sat positioned opposite him, his sleeves rolled precisely to the forearm, glasses positioned on the bridge of his nose, and his hands placed flat upon the table surface with palms down, remaining absolutely motionless. That stillness carried profound weight because Newsom embodied entirely finished surfaces and active motion, refined exterior and constant movement, whereas Vance appeared to be an individual who had arrived with substantially less theatricality and considerably more definitive documentation. He permitted the local juice stand comparison to linger in the chamber for multiple seconds, then multiple seconds more without recoiling, without amusement, and without providing the governor the satisfaction of witnessing any apparent injury, handling the insult precisely how an individual handles an inaccurate invoice at a restaurant. You refrain from shouting and instead pick it up, analyze it with precision, and compel the other party to clarify each and every specific assessment. When he finally delivered his response, his voice was muted, monotonic, and methodical, not quiet, but rigidly managed, the vocal tone of an individual acutely aware that the statistical evidence was vastly weightier than any auditory emphasis he could potentially apply. Vance stated, "Governor, you are absolutely correct," the sentence landing with an unusual impact because it didn't challenge the initial assertion. Instead, it accepted the polished premise and prepared to convert it into definitive proof against the very individual who had introduced it. California is indeed the world's fifth largest economy. That point is factually accurate, he said as he opened the folder positioned before him, the simple rustle of paper consequently becoming more intimidating than Newsom's entire refined presentation. And I wish to supplement that ranking with one other figure. He cast a singular glance downward, then redirected his focus upward, stating 1,200,000, and allowed that statistic to situate itself directly adjacent to the gross domestic product ranking like a photograph placed immediately beside a reflection, because the reflection displayed the curated image of California that Newsom wanted shown, whereas the photograph displayed the actual citizens loading transport containers before dawn. 1,200,000 net residents have abandoned California for different states since your inauguration, he said, needing no vocal escalation since the figure itself resonated with enough volume, adding, "They didn't relocate because they became unemployed, Governor. The vast majority possessed employment. They departed because your economic system rendered existence in the state unaffordable for them." That initial rhetorical thrust was absolute and decisive because it pierced directly through the boasts. The world's fifth most significant economy had effectively become a location where middle-class individuals could maintain full-time employment, fulfill every societal obligation, adhere to every regulation, and still conclude the month staring at obligations like rent, groceries, gasoline, insurance, childcare, and taxes, as if they were a barrier vastly too substantial to overcome. Newsom had presented the gross domestic product metrics as a prestigious trophy. Vance responded with the actual human beings who had felt compelled to escape from beneath it. Newsom had presented massive scale, glamour, impressive rankings, and international comparisons, all the expansive concepts that make governance appear magnificent from a podium. But Vance responded with the single most damaging indictment available in politics. Your citizens departed. Your gross domestic product may rank fifth in the world, and your middle class cannot meet its rental obligations, Vance said, his hands still positioned flat and motionless, his facial expression entirely calm, and his voice persistently refusing to engage in any performative emphasis. That specific declaration required no artificial enhancements, nor did it necessitate the flourishes typically provided by speechwriters. It was profound and brutal because it was sufficiently small to resonate within a private kitchen discussion, yet sufficiently significant to dismantle an entire philosophy of governance. Vance directed his gaze explicitly at Newsom and stated, "You referenced Ohio. You are accurate. Ohio does rank 47th in gross domestic product expansion," delivering the governor's statistic back to him not in a defensive or apologetic manner, but rather like returning a borrowed instrument, adding, "And you know what else Ohio is not? Ohio is not a state that citizens are abandoning." The entire dynamic within the room shifted because the basis of comparison had transformed from prestige and international rankings to basic livability, and prestige was the arena where Newsom remained formidable, whereas livability was precisely where the statistics began to demonstrate rot. Vance stated, "No individual is packing up a moving vehicle in Columbus at 3 in the morning and steering across the desert because they can no longer sustain existence in that location," adding, "Yet they are engaging in that behavior in California each and every day." He paused, and the hesitation was far from theatrical, functioning instead as the crucial moment where everyone in the chamber was compelled to mentally visualize the scene. I know this for a fact because they arrive in my home state and explicitly articulate the reasons they departed yours. There it was. The singular element Newsom could not dilute into a marketing slogan because the individuals abandoning California were far from abstract data points in a spreadsheet. Once they crossed a border and initiated conversations with neighbors, employers, clergy, landlords, and relatives, they transformed from metrics into human testimony. Then Vance deliberately inverted the beverage stand insult back onto the governor, sufficiently slowly for everyone present to observe the handle transferring ownership, stating, "You asserted that Ohio amounts to a local juice stand. Mama would have appreciated that comparison." The specific reference to Mama dramatically altered the emotional temperature within the chamber, not due to sentimentality, but because it yanked the debate out of the professional consultant arena and directly back into a household where financial resources carried a distinct sound, mood, limit, and tangible consequence. Vance added, "She effectively operated something akin to a local juice stand, except it happened to be a household functioning on $11 an hour." Newsom had delivered a speech on aggregate economies. Vance spoke specifically regarding a kitchen table, adding, "And yet nobody departed," explaining, "Because in Ohio, $11 an hour purchased you a roof over your head, a standard meal, and a school for your children." He didn't necessitate stating that California had drastically failed that fundamental assessment, because he declared it in the very next statement, explaining, "In California, Governor, $11 an hour purchases you a canvas tent situated upon the sidewalk and an 18-month wait time for a temporary shelter bed." This comparison was not merely an assessment between two different states, but rather a profound comparison between what governance publicizes it values versus what that governance actually generates. California had wrapped itself comprehensively in the rhetoric of compassion and somehow constructed an entire system where compassion necessitated an extensive waiting list, a mandatory press conference, and a concrete sidewalk. Therefore, yes, Vance persisted. And by this moment, the entire chamber had become absolutely silent in a manner that Newsom's initial gross domestic product assertion had not achieved. Ohio is relatively small, Ohio remains quiet, and no publications compose cover stories regarding Ohio. Vance folded his hands, finally altering their position but only subtly, the restraint rendering the movement feel absolutely decisive, adding, "However, the individuals who reside there can genuinely afford to remain there." Then he looked directly at Newsom with the calm demeanor of a person who had just removed the governor's preferred assessment metric and systematically substituted it with a standard rental invoice, declaring, "And that metric, I would firmly argue, constitutes the entire objective of effective governance." The legislative aide positioned behind Newsom refrained from adjusting any additional items perhaps she had deduced, perhaps even before Newsom explicitly permitted himself to realize that the juice stand comparison had not landed with the desired effect. The maneuver had effectively invited Vance into precisely the specific type of debate Newsom could not potentially win, because the more Newsom explicitly bragged regarding California's size and economic output, the more catastrophic the mass exodus appeared. A relatively small state losing its population can easily be rationalized and dismissed, but a massive, wealthy, famous, and future-oriented state losing an extreme net total of 1.2 million residents effectively becomes a confession framed with palm trees. Vance extracted a singular page from the document folder, not rapidly or theatrically, but with the patient assurance of a person who recognized the documentation required no external assistance to inflict substantial damage, and read, "Your administration has authorized $24 billion on homelessness initiatives since you assumed office." That specific number situated itself there, possessing the ugly, heavy burden of an expenditure too substantial to justify and too explicit to rationalize away. Newsom's rebuttal emerged instantly, smooth and reflexive, polished by constant repetition in the exact way a professional car dealer provides an answer before the customer has even finished indicating the obvious aesthetic dent, stating, "And that singular investment has yielded highly significant results." California has successfully funded 44,000 residential units, expanded temporary shelter capacity by 30%, and established the most significant governor. Vance cut in immediately, and his voice didn't necessarily arise because the vocal intensity was unnecessary, stating, simultaneously, while you were authorizing $24 billion, the homeless population in California actually increased by 31%. The interruption was far from loud, yet it was absolute and final, the type of dynamic interruption that doesn't battle for perceived dominance simply because the definitive statistic has already taken command of the entire chamber. Nationally, that specific population decreased by 10%, Vance continued, fixing his gaze on Newsom for an interval sufficient for the contrast to become utterly impossible to minimize, declaring, your state experienced an increase while the remainder of the country observed a decrease as you authorized the most substantial funding in the nation and yet generated the single absolute worst outcomes in the country. Newsom's left hand performed a minimal open palm gesture, one of those sophisticated, precise, highly educated minor movements politicians frequently utilize when they are attempting to make a catastrophic collapse appear to be merely a complex nuance, stating, with the greatest respect, Senator, that specific statistic completely fails to account for the migration patterns of homeless individuals from other jurisdictions into California, drawn specifically by our ideal climate and the extreme generosity of our localized services. There it was, the background detail, the generic fog machine often used by the public bureaucracy rolled across the chamber floor whenever the audience gets uncomfortably close to the wreckage. He wasn't overtly denying the presence of tents, not refuting the specific data, nor disputing the drastic increase. He was systematically attempting to relocate the accountability entirely to weather patterns and institutional compassion, as if mild winters and empathetic messaging had somehow personally authorized $24 billion without necessary permission. Vance glanced downward at the documentation and then redirected his focus directly back at him, and the entire room intuitively understood the response long before he even articulated it. So your formal defense, Governor, is that your state is so generous and accommodating that homeless individuals from distinct states deliberately travel to California specifically to be homeless there? He replied, I am explicitly stating that the comprehensive data requires background nuance. And the sentence resonated with less magnitude than he had likely intended, simply because every single word had already been employed far too frequently in the past. Vance declared, Senator, the actual context is $24 billion authorized and 31% more homeless citizens. That is the definitive context. That was exactly where the overall atmosphere in the chamber changed, because administrative failure is one dynamic, but untracked failure authorized at historic massive cost is something entirely distinct. It is not merely that California authorized unprecedented funding and failed to mitigate the systemic issue, it is that California authorized funding at a monetary scale. Most everyday citizens cannot possibly comprehend, observe the visible societal crisis actively expand, and then could not clearly articulate it to its own designated auditor where that massive sum had ultimately gone. In normal life, when large amounts of money vanish and no measurable improvement occurs, an individual inevitably loses a job, an individual answers difficult questions, and individuals cease using the euphemisms of investment and instead initiate the specific vocabulary of accountability. In Newsom's California, the bureaucratic vocabulary remained consistently soft. The posture of the administration persisted as noble and pure, and yet the public sidewalks remained comprehensively full. Vance stated, $24 billion, and added, and you are unable to explicitly inform the independent auditor regarding where it is located. Newsom's response emerged from a mental shelf that was already running significantly lower on remaining inventory than it had been at the very beginning of the proceeding, explaining, the detailed auditor's report prioritized and identified specific areas for improvement, and we have already aggressively initiated implementing those areas of necessary improvement. Vance repeated, necessary areas of improvement, not mockingly in actual volume but surgically in precise timing, The exact manner a prosecutor repeats a specific phrase because he wants the jury to explicitly hear how utterly absurd it sounds outside of the mouth that originally produced it, adding $24 billion authorized in areas for improvement. He paused, and the silence proved highly effective because it permitted the phrase to metaphorically spoil in the open chamber air before adding, "Governor, if I provided Mama with $24 billion and she subsequently could not explicitly articulate where it went, she would not characterize it as a mere area for improvement. She would characterize it as a definitive problem." Status. Then Vance deliberately made the problem human and tangible again, because that specific arena was where Newsom's refined vocabulary consistently failed, stating, "And then she would find the specific money," explaining, "because in Mama's household you didn't simply lose $24 billion and label it a standard learning experience." Newsom's face didn't show signs of breakage, not completely, because leaders like him are trained meticulously never to break character in the public square. Yet the polished confidence that had initially carried him through the local juice stand comparison was no longer operating with the same fluidity. Vance turned to another page in the documentation, and the action appeared almost casual, which rendered it far worse for Newsom, as he stated, "When you campaigned for governor back in 2018, you explicitly informed California citizens that you would," and he read the precise quote, "end homelessness as we know it." He articulated the promise in a flat vocal tone without adding any heat, simply because the specific promise was already sufficiently potent when situated directly adjacent to the actual results, adding, "That was your explicit pledge." He looked back down at the documentation and added, "In 2018, California possessed approximately 129,000 homeless citizens. Today, Governor, it possesses over 180,000. He set the page back down on the table, and the physical movement carried the clean, final weight of a completed receipt sliding across a counter surface. As he concluded, "You did not end homelessness, Governor. You actively funded it. You meticulously constructed a $24 billion system that actively generates homelessness, and you cannot articulate to the auditor where the money went." Subsequently came the direct transition back to the individuals who had departed, because the homelessness catastrophe and the mass exodus were far from separate narratives. They were symptoms of the identical governance philosophy that conflated spending totals with effective governing, as he added, "And yet you characterize the people who departed as a complete myth." Mr. Vice President, permit me to articulate something regarding California that I don't believe gets said with sufficient frequency in environments like this, Newsom stated, his voice finding its true resonance. Not the quick argumentative tone nor the administrative data vocalization, but the other one, the voice that sounded almost presidential, primarily because it had clearly been refined in scenarios where mirrors were trusted far more than actual voters. He retreated back to the generalized postcard because the definitive spreadsheet was metaphorical bleeding. Hollywood, Silicon Valley, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Pacific Coast Highway. The catalog emerged like a tourism advertisement masquerading as a cohesive argument. Vance listened as Newsom stated, "Nobody grows up in Nebraska fantasizing about Ohio, Mr. Vice President. They dream specifically about California." The smile resurfaced, thinner now but still visible, because the smile was no longer evidence of true confidence. It was a practiced habit searching desperately for a legitimate reason to survive. Then he strategically introduced the corporations, because leaders like Newsom universally introduce the corporations when the actual citizens become inconvenient, stating, "And the specific companies that the entire remainder of the world depends on, Apple, Google, Tesla, Netflix, they did not originate in Ohio, they originated in California." That logic sounded formidable, provided you refrained from inquiring who could still afford to actually live near those innovative campuses, who meticulously cleaned the executive offices, who stocked the employee cafeterias, or who commuted 2 hours in each direction because the specialized innovation economy had effectively innovated everyday workers completely out of their own residential zip codes. Vance waited for the intended applause that the sentence generated, but the room had already confronted the definitive metrics. A prestigious dream that necessitates the maintenance janitor's departure is far from a real dream. It is a polished showroom with the actual laborers cleverly hidden behind a localized service entrance. The senator waited for the smile to conclude completely, and that deliberate waiting constituted its own distinct type of psychological discipline, before saying, "Governor, the individuals who meticulously built those specific companies can absolutely afford to live within California." He continued, with his hands not having moved from their position flat on the table. "The individuals who clean those specific companies' offices cannot." The declaration cut right through the glamour with the directness of an official eviction notice, as he added, "That constitutes the modern California dream now. The prestigious founders stay, the janitors leave, and you are standing here selling me the narrative of the founders. Can he see?" For a brief interval, Newsom possessed no clean emotional location to put his facial expression. He had attempted massive scale, international prestige, profound symbolism, the idealized old California dream, and the comprehensive cinematic catalog of bridges, highways, studios, campuses, and coastlines. Vance had systematically forced him back to the everyday citizens wiping down tables inside architectural structures whose collective stock valuations could potentially purchase entire municipalities. That specific dynamic was the absolute trap California's political ruling class never wanted to discuss. They had constructed a paradise optimized for capital and labeled it compassion, all while everyday workers were being systematically priced into involuntary exile. Vance proceeded to turn another page in the documentation, and the subsequent subject was waiting like a locked chamber everyone already intuited was present. As he stated, "Governor, I want to discuss November 6th, 2020. Newsom's chin elevated perhaps a single millimeter. He intuitively knew that specific date, and every individual within the room also knew the date, because certain political scandals survive not because they are complex, but specifically because they are sufficiently simple for every single citizen to understand in a single photographic image. I have explicitly addressed the French Laundry restaurant incident publicly, repeatedly, and I have officially taken full and comprehensive responsibility for it," Newsom said before Vance cut in to clarify. "You have officially apologized for it, I am aware of that," adding, "But I would like to discuss the citizens, Governor, not the generic apology." He proceeded to read the definitive facts, which were flat and specific, with the dry technical precision of an individual reading charges off an itemized bill to someone who has spent consecutive years disputing the total sum. November 6, 2020. You were photographed at the upscale French laundry establishment situated in Napa Valley without a mask, in the presence of 12 other individuals comprising multiple households, with lobbyists specifically representing the California Medical Association seated on either side of you. Each precise phrase landed independently and separately, not ornamented because embellishment would have significantly weakened the factual impact, as he added, "The identical organization that was actively funding television advertisements instructing everyday Californians to wear masks and remain home." Newsom remained absolutely still, but the stillness was no longer relaxed or confident. "The average check at the French Laundry is approximately $400 per individual," Vance stated, and he permitted the specific statistic to remain present because this number was vastly smaller than 24 billion, smaller than 33 billion, and smaller than 1.2 million, but somehow infinitely more intimate. $400 was a monetary figure everyday people could genuinely feel. It was a full grocery week, a comprehensive utility bill, a monthly car payment, or a week's wages for an individual attempting to survive under rules meticulously drafted by people who possess confirmed reservations at exclusive restaurants. The public was simultaneously being explicitly instructed not to enter. On that very same day, Vance persisted, everyday Californians were being informed that the ordinary vital rituals of grief, labor, worship, schooling, and family were vastly too dangerous for them. On that same day, Governor, there were Californians who were forbidden from visiting their dying parents in the hospital because of your direct lockdown mandate. The chamber fell silent in an entirely different manner because data indicts a general policy, but that specific declaration indicted a profound memory. There were children who had not physically been inside a classroom in 8 full months. He didn't necessitate a description of what that dynamic did to families, to mothers laboring from kitchen tables, to fathers desperately attempting to keep paychecks viable, to children falling behind academically while political leaders congratulated themselves publicly for genuinely caring. There were business owners who had sealed their commercial storefronts and were forced to watch their life savings rapidly evaporate because you informed them it was too dangerous to operate, he said, as Vance set his glasses down on the table. And yet you were physically at the French Laundry restaurant with professional lobbyists without a mask consuming $400 per plate. Newsom's response arrived in 4 words, smooth from extreme overuse and softened comprehensively by repetitive use, until it resonated less like authentic remorse and more like a simple reflex. I made a definitive mistake. But Vance was far from there merely to collect the standardized apology. He was present to weigh it against the everyday people who had ultimately paid the price for the regulations, adding, "You made a mistake," the sentence coming back colder than the generic apology because it didn't accept the apology as full payment for the dynamic. While a waitress in Sacramento was being fined specifically for serving coffee outdoors, while a salon owner in Los Angeles was actively arrested for cutting hair in her own private shop, while pastors were actively threatened with incarceration for holding Sunday services in their parking lots. Instead, Vance maintained the identical flat Middletown vocal tone, the same methodical pace, and the same absolute refusal to ornament the truth for the comfort of the individual seated directly opposite him. They adhered to your regulations, Governor, every single one of them, the waitress, the salon owner, and the pastor. They all adhered to your specific regulations, and you went to dinner. The entire chamber didn't require a sermon after that statement because the inherent hypocrisy was not abstract, not concealed in a complex regulatory footnote, nor hidden behind a generic budget category with 6 vague words and 0 accountability. It was visual, almost cruelly straightforward. Everyday Californians locked out of their livelihoods, locked away from their parents, locked into residential homes with children who had not seen physical classrooms in consecutive months, while the governor sat comfortably with professional lobbyists at one of the single most exclusive restaurants in the nation. Vance replaced his glasses, and the minimal physical motion returned the entire proceeding to paper, statistics, records, and the cold reality of a table where apologies were required to sit immediately adjacent to their definitive consequences. Governor, $400 constitutes what Mama earned in an entire week. The statement landed with greater impact because it systematically reduced the distance between the exclusive restaurant and an everyday household financial budget, as Vance added, 40 hours laboring at the Armco plant, and you authorized it for a single dinner engagement with professional lobbyists without a mask, while simultaneously informing the woman who cleaned the French Laundry's kitchen that she was forbidden from eating inside her own mother's residence. Vance then turned the page in the documentation, and the subsequent figure was not intimate or accessible like $400. It was absolutely monstrous. And while we are currently on the subject of massive sums of money that evaporated during the COVID pandemic, your localized employment development department during that pandemic lost an estimated $33 billion to absolute fraud. Vance added $33 billion and repeated it a second time because a statistic that substantial necessitates a mandatory second pass before the human mind can even pretend to cognitively hold it, declaring, "That constitutes the single largest unemployment fraud in the comprehensive history of any state, in the entire history of this country." Newsom shifted in his chair, the action constituting the first full-body adjustment he had visibly made since the proceeding had officially commenced, and it was far from dramatic, yet it was distinctly visible to everyone present. Prior to that specific moment, his physical posture had been a deliberate message, relaxed, confident, and preordained, a man entirely in command of the proceeding's tempo. Now the chair seemed to have completely changed beneath him. The unique EDD situation constituted a nationwide challenge, and the response emerged rapidly because fast responses are useful whenever slower responses might reveal internal panic, adding, "Every single state experienced significantly elevated fraud during the unprecedented pandemic, and we have since extensively implemented." Vance cut in immediately, cutting through the bureaucratic fog before it possessed any ability to spread, clarifying, California accounted for more pandemic unemployment fraud than the next three states combined. Phrase wasn't shouted nor loaded with any extra visible indignation, and that flat delivery rendered it significantly worse. It sounded like objective accounting, and accounting is merciless primarily because it remains indifferent to how sophisticated or refined the excuse might be. $33 billion, Vance continued, constitutes more than the gross domestic product of half the recognized countries on Earth. The comparison wasn't provided for metaphorical flourish. It was present strictly to make massive scale physically visible, as a sum so large that entire families could potentially live collective lifetimes beneath it, had passed through a government system like common water through cracked concrete. Your response was to characterize it as a definitive area for improvement. That singular phrase again, systematically dragged back into the absolute center of the table like bagged and tagged evidence for a trial, as he added, "That specific phrase persistently reappears, Governor." Vance's vocal tone remained entirely level, but the sentence clearly possessed teeth, adding, "$24 billion on homelessness that actively got worse, area for improvement, $33 billion in fraud, area for improvement." At what specific dollar amount does it officially stop being characterized as an area for improvement and start being categorized as a failure? Newsom's mouth opened briefly, then closed. His eyes darted to the left again, the same subtle search, the same scan for a generic shelf that had served him so well earlier in the proceeding and was currently yielding nothing but metaphorical dust. Vance replied, "You implemented reforms immediately after you lost $33 billion, adding, Governor, Mama possessed a definitive phrase for that dynamic too. She characterized it as closing the barn door after the horse has already departed." Then he drove the rhetorical blade in with the calmest portion of the sentence, explaining, "Except in your case, the horse took $33 billion along with it, and nobody even noticed until the independent auditor arrived." Somewhere in the gallery, an older woman with graying hair, sitting with her purse positioned on her lap, shook her head once, not for the surrounding cameras, not for the room, but strictly for herself. It was the private, profound headshake of an individual who had stopped attempting to comprehend how a government could misplace financial sums that everyday people could not even imagine touching. There are monetary numbers so massive they effectively cease sounding like actual money, and that is precisely how comprehensive political failure survives them, by transforming into something too enormous for standardized outrage. However, the senator did not permit the statistic to simply float away into abstract theory. He persistently pulled it back to governance, to consequence, and to the simplest standard every household intimately knows without requiring a specialized consultant to explain it. If you lose money and the initial problem escalates, you have failed. If you create a system and criminals can walk through it with billions, you have failed. If the people living under your regulations sacrifice while the rulers dine, you have failed. If the standardized answer to every subsequent failure is a slightly smoother sentence, then the failure itself is not accidental anymore. It constitutes the operational model. Vance stated, "And one final item before we move on," pulling a physical printout from the documentation folder. Vance said, "You stated," and he read the precise words, "and I'm reading your words, the California exodus is a myth." Vance deliberately placed the printout back down on the table with the specific patience of an individual setting down a trap that had already successfully closed, adding, "You characterized it as a myth, Governor." The specific word situated itself there, poisonous now, primarily because it had sounded exceptionally clever whenever Newsom employed it on a podcast, dismissive in the exact way smooth politicians dismiss unpleasant realities they cannot possibly spin into an offensive strength. But in this hearing room, situated immediately beside the migration statistics, situated adjacent to the transport trucks, situated beside the families abandoning schools and employment and parents and profound memories, myth no longer sounded clever. It resonated instead as absolute contempt. "You looked directly into a camera lens," Vance stated, "and said the word myth regarding 1,200,000 individuals who packed their entire lives into moving vehicles and left your state." Newsom moved rapidly because this was a strategic location where he persistently believed he possessed a definitive counterargument, stating, "If you look exclusively at the most recent data sets, California has officially observed significant population growth in the last 2 years." Vance clarified immediately, "Because of international immigration, Governor," adding, "Not because American citizens are moving into California." "Americans are leaving California," Vance declared, adding, 1,200,000 more Americans have departed California than have moved in from other states." Yeah. It was a highly significant correction, not merely statistical, but moral and ethical. Newsom wanted the singular headline of generic population growth to erase the living testimony of domestic flight, as if a cumulative net figure possessed the ability to cancel the profound meaning of citizens actively choosing to abandon a state they once fought so hard to afford. Vance folded his hands together and added, "You didn't characterize it as a myth because it wasn't occurring. The dynamic slowed the chamber down completely. You characterized it as a myth strictly because the undeniable truth was deeply embarrassing. And 1,200,000 individuals who loaded their children into vehicles and steered across a desert deserve better than a governor who characterizes their profound decision as a complete myth." The worst component for Newsom was strictly that Vance had not necessitated adding a new scandal to render the word ugly. He had merely situated it adjacent to the everyday people it sought to erase. Subsequently, Vance reached physically beneath the documentation folder, not to the top sheet, nor to the visible stack, but entirely underneath, where the next definitive document had been patiently waiting. He extracted a singular page of entirely different paper stock possessing an internal header, the specific formatting of a document never intended for cameras, never intended for voters, and never designed for the cold, merciless light of a legislative hearing room. It appeared to be the exact type of internal memo that moves quietly from one government desk to another inside a bureaucratic building, carrying exceptionally bad news in entirely neutral language so that no individual has to physically say the obvious truth out loud. For the single first time, the flawless suit, the perfect hair, the curated smile, and the entire refined architecture of Gavin Newsom appeared aware of a noticeable draft in the chamber. "Governor," Vance stated, "I want to read you something your own executive office wrote." The statement was completely devastating even before the actual contents had officially begun because outside criticism can easily be dismissed as partisan, attacks can be strategically framed, and hostile inquiries can be publicly mocked. However, an internal memo is inherently different. An internal memo effectively constitutes the government speaking precisely when it believes the public is not actively listening. It is the House talking explicitly to itself after all the guests have departed, and when the House speaks honestly, the marketing slogans usually die first. This is an internal policy memorandum originating from your governor's office, explicitly dated March 2022. Vance lowered his eyes to the page and read, "The generic housing-first approach is not delivering the projected year-over-year results. Homeless counts persistently continue to rise despite sustained funding increases. We recommend pivoting immediately to treatment first or a hybrid operational model. Continuing the current strategy without adjustment risks the entire $24 billion investment producing no measurable reduction in homelessness and generates significant audit exposure." He looked up from the page only after that last specific phrase had fully landed in the chamber. Audit exposure. Not moral exposure, not human exposure, nor the tangible exposure of human beings sleeping under tarps while officials praised massive investments. Strictly audit exposure. The specific bureaucratic fear hidden beneath the humanitarian slogan, the singular moment when even the internal language of the administration admitted that the entire policy was not functional and that the massive sum of money might eventually become a political problem if anyone followed it closely enough. Newsom stated nothing whatsoever. There are silences that resemble strategic restraint, and there are distinct silences that resemble an individual waiting anxiously to see how much of the original document the other party actually possesses. Vance turned the page over, reading, "Your chief of staff's response was 2 distinct sentences," and he read them with the identical steady pace, adding, "Governor reviewed, He wants to stay with housing first. The $24 billion number is the definitive message. Changing approach looks like we were wrong. Stay the course. He set the page back down on the table, and this time the physical paper looked significantly heavier than mere paper. Subsequently, he looked directly at Newsom, and all the earlier arguments, the gross domestic product, the local juice stand comparison, the California dream narrative, the corporations, the apologies, the generic reforms, the population migration context, all of it seemed to collapse completely into that one single sentence. Not the results generated, not the actual human beings situated under elevated freeway ramps, not the families stepping carefully around used needles outside apartments they could barely afford, not the internal audit, not the negative trend, nor the comprehensive failure. The massive number itself was the message, which ultimately meant the authorized spending had transformed into the primary achievement, even if that authorized spending successfully achieved absolutely nothing. Your professional staff explicitly informed you the approach was actively failing, Vance stated, and by this moment the chamber did not resemble a legislative hearing as much as a public autopsy conducted without requiring a scalpel. He tapped the memorandum once, not hard or dramatically, but strictly enough to remind every individual present that the document was still there, still real, and still refusing to vanish back into the metaphorical hallway where it had been born. He permitted the sentence to physically breathe within the room because it deserved to be heard without any auditory interference whatsoever. The individuals sleeping upon the sidewalks of San Francisco this evening are not there because California is unfortunate, Governor. They are situated there specifically because your staff informed you the approach was actively failing, and you ultimately chose the prioritized talking point over the practical fix. He directed his gaze at Newsom as if the flawless suit, the perfect hair, and the trained smile had finally transformed into entirely irrelevant objects within the chamber. Because fixing the issue meant explicitly admitting you were wrong, and admitting you were wrong would have cost you something vastly more important to you than $24 billion. It would have cost you the next political headline. That was the singular sentence that stripped the chamber down to the metaphorical studs, not ideology nor complexity, climate, interstate migration, innovation, nor the Golden Gate Bridge glowing in campaign footage. The internal memo had not merely suggested potential failure, it had vividly demonstrated the explicit internal calculation, the quiet choice to preserve the idealized message even while the street-level reality drastically deteriorated. And once the chamber understood that core dynamic, every single earlier phrase sounded different. Investment sounded like camouflage, compassion sounded like branding, and area for improvement sounded like a velvet blanket positioned over a broken mechanism. Vance reiterated. His own professional staff had informed him the approach was actively failing. They had put it comprehensively in writing. His response was, "The $24 billion number is the message. Stay the course. Subscribe." Wadiat. Hisiko persistently remained in his chair, hands positioned on the table with palms down, the identical position he had held since the proceed had officially commenced, and that consistency transformed into its own distinct argument. Newsom had arrived with extreme sheen, motion, smile, and physical stature, the complete architecture of an individual built specifically for television cameras. But Vance had barely shifted his position, and the contrast expanded progressively sharper the longer the proceeding continued. "Governor," he said, "you are the single most refined politician I have ever had the opportunity to sit positioned opposite, and I mean that sincerely." But the statement didn't resonate like genuine praise. It resonated instead as the crucial opening sentence of a political diagnosis. He added, "Your hair is flawless, your suit is perfect, and your statistics are always instantly ready." The entire chamber remained silent because every individual could clearly visualize the intended target, and every individual knew the bullet was still in active travel. Subsequently, he significantly widened the framework, not by inventing a novel narrative, but strictly by naming the profound difference between the lives physically represented at that table. "You grew up in the prestigious Getty family orbit, Governor. Your father was a personal friend of Gordon Getty, one of the single wealthiest individuals in all of California. Newsom's face remained composed, yet the profound stillness had transformed into visible defensiveness. Vance continued. Getty's family actively helped finance your first business enterprise, Plumpjack, which began as a wine shop, then a restaurant, and subsequently a hotel. He did not sneer at success, primarily because sneering would have significantly weakened the ethical point. He simply placed the origin narrative adjacent to the everyday people Newsom currently governs, adding, "You initiated your path from the metaphorical top and built upward. I initiated my path from a household where the basic lights frequently got shut off, and I built sideways." That dynamic was the profound arena Newsom could not charm his way around, primarily because it was far from about a professional resume. It was about who had ever actually felt a common utility bill become a severe emergency. "And you have never been required to physically live in the California that you meticulously constructed for them," Vance stated. The indictment was no longer strictly regarding migration, homelessness, fraud, or dinner. It was entirely regarding insulation, the most expensive, significant political luxury available in America, the ability to draft rules whose actual consequences land upon other people. "The individuals who abandoned California were far from leaving your economy," Vance declared, clarifying, "Your idealized economy is fine. The gross domestic product is fine, the billionaires are fine, the prestigious founders are fine, and the Getty family is fine." Vance picked up the memorandum one more time, and the physical page seemed to pull every single earlier statistic back into one single line of accusation, explaining, "They were abandoning your governance. They were abandoning a state where $24 billion purchases you vastly more homelessness, where $33 billion vanishes completely into fraud and nobody gets terminated, where a governor dines while a waitress gets fined strictly for serving coffee." And then the senator made it utterly impossible for the proceeding to remain abstract or theoretical. Vance stated, "There is a specific family right now, tonight, situated somewhere on Interstate 10, positioned between Los Angeles and Houston, possessing everything they own in a common U-Haul trailer, with 2 children asleep in the backseat of a Honda." He added, "That specific family is far from leaving because they do not love California." His voice dropped, not dramatically, but down into a lower register that resonated less like a hearing inquiry and more like something strictly meant for the official, permanent record, explain, "They love California, they grew up in California, and their parents grew up in California. They are departing specifically because you rendered it utterly impossible to love California and physically reside there at the same time." He leaned back subtly in his chair, and the entire chamber seemed to lean forward unconsciously without even meaning to, as he added, "Mama used to frequently say, if people are leaving, refrain from asking where they went, ask instead what you did." He set his glasses down upon the table immediately beside the internal memorandum, and the minimal click of the metal hinges was the absolute only audible sound for a meaningful interval. That statistic was all he required, and it was sufficient, because there exist hearings where the single loudest entity said is a singular question that no individual can answer without making a profound confession. The committee chairman inquired with the governor regarding whether he wished to offer a response. Newsom opened his mouth to reply, initiating with, "California is..." But the sentence stopped completely, not because California was the incorrect word, but primarily because California had persistently always been the word that initiated every speech, concluded every press conference, and carried every political ambition he had diligently polished for 2 full decades. California effectively constituted the escape hatch, the brand, the shield, and the gilded noun behind which every administrative failure could be arranged into a prettier photograph. But this specific time, the complete sentence that was intended to follow the word sat securely locked behind a door, and positioned between him and that door stood 1,200,000 actual people who had packed their entire lives into moving vehicles and departed. His eyes darted to the left, downward and upward, the microscopic visual search of a person actively scanning for a definitive statistic, a prestigious ranking, or a clever slogan, anything from the entire shelf of statistics that had served him so effectively all morning. Vance added, He had used the gross domestic product, he had used the corporations, and he had used innovation, climate, diversity, complexity, migration, growth, and context. And the same tired phrase regarding mandatory areas for improvement. Every single statistic had been strategically deployed, meticulously peeled open, and subsequently set back down upon the table surface emptier than it had been before the proceeding began. What remained was merely an individual in a flawless suit possessing a perfect smile, and absolutely nothing behind either of them that possessed the ability to answer a simple three-word question: "What did you do?" Newsom tried again to reply, initiating with, "I am proud," and the perfected smile remained upon his face, primarily because the smile had been present all morning, had been present for his entire professional career, and had been trained into place so comprehensively that it no longer required active belief to appear. But Vance added, his eyes were not in it. His eyes were somewhere else, actively scanning the empty shelf of what California had constructed, what California had authorized, what California had promised, and what California had systematically failed to fix. Proud of authorized investment, not of actual results. Proud of professional effort, not of societal outcomes. Proud of the funding exiting the system, not of what that funding actually purchased for the citizens, nor the families situated in the desert, the waitress fined specifically for coffee, the salon owner punished for labor, the pastor threatened for worship, or the mother who deceased behind rigid hospital regulations while relatives waited anxiously outside. None of it was going to magically disappear simply because an individual with flawless hair categorized it as a mandatory area for improvement. None of it was going to soften because the Public Communications Office successfully located a better administrative verb. The shared clip surpassed 50 million views in just 3 days, with commentators frequently labeling it the Exodus clip. Yet the version that circulated most rapidly was shorter, significantly sharper, and far crueler in its simplicity. The prestigious Founders' Day, the janitors depart, 1,200,000 individuals. Governor, what did you do? It transformed into the specific type of video that everyday people refrained from sharing with extensive commentary. Instead, they transmitted it with absolute silence or with a single word, or with the specific name of a cousin who had abandoned Sacramento. A brother who had departed San Jose, a teacher who had abandoned Los Angeles, a nurse who had departed San Diego, or a mechanic who had abandoned Riverside. The Office of the State Auditor officially announced a mandatory formal review of the internal memorandum. The governor's communications agency released a 3-sentence statement that strategically utilized the word investment 4 times and the word results 0 times. Absolutely no individual who read the statement missed that ratio. Simultaneously, 2 Democratic members of the California State Legislature released a comprehensive joint statement formally calling for full transparency regarding homelessness expenditures. In Sacramento, that phrase universally constitutes the specific statement that precedes formal investigations, and formal investigations universally constitute the phrase that precedes compulsory subpoenas. Carlos and Maria had abandoned Riverside, California, exactly 3 days earlier. They had successfully sold their 3-bedroom residence in a neighborhood possessing cracked sidewalks and schools rated a 4 out of 10 for $620,000. That amount sounded like a true fortune until it became entirely clear that it really constituted an exit ticket. In Katy, Texas, where Maria's cousin resided, a 4-bedroom residence possessing a large backyard and a school rated an 8 out of 10 cost $320,000. The essential math was far from complicated. The math constituted the fundamental reason they were currently driving through the dark desert at 10 o'clock at night, with absolutely everything they owned situated in a trailer immediately behind them. Carlos heard the audio clip play on the vehicle's car radio, not the video itself, just the audio transmission of Vance's voice stating, 1,200,000 individuals. Governor, what did you do? He gazed out the window at the dark desert terrain passing by and mentally thought, I am one of them. Then he instantly corrected himself, thinking, no, I am far from one of 1. 2 million. I am one singular man, one singular family, one set of keys handed directly back to a real estate agent in a living room that persistently still smelled like his daughter's shampoo. The desert landscape was dark, the roadway was straight, the children were fast asleep, and California was situated entirely behind them. It was physically getting significantly farther away with every consecutive mile, and it would persistently keep getting farther because you cannot possibly return to a place that has systematically priced you out of your own memory. Situated in the vice president's office at the Naval Observatory, JD Vance sat positioned with a glass of common water and a yellow legal writing pad. He meticulously wrote 3 distinct words in the precise handwriting that Mama had made him diligently practice every evening at the kitchen table until the letters were straight. Where did they go? He used absolutely no question mark because it was not truly a generic question. It constituted a definitive verdict, and verdicts do not inquire, they ultimately arrive. Vance wrote, situated in the governor's mansion located in Sacramento, Gavin Newsom stood directly in front of the bathroom mirror wearing a white undershirt with his tie hanging loosely from his collar. They did not abandon the state because they were angry. They did not leave because they were political. They departed strictly because the metaphorical wall was soft, the actual rent was hard, and the tent situated on the sidewalk constituted the only entity the $24 billion had constructed that you could actually visually see from the street. 1,200,000 individuals departed, and he characterized it as a complete myth. $24 billion went toward homelessness, and homelessness actively got worse. $33 billion vanished into absolute fraud, and no individual got terminated. A French laundry restaurant dinner occurred while families were forbidden from visiting dying parents, and a professional staff memorandum stated that the $24 billion constituted the message, not the practical solution. Subscribe, leave one singular word in the comments. Exodus, share this with someone who abandoned California because they know.